Okay, today we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. We're going to start with Art Deco, kinetic art, political art, and then we're going to be looking at the modernist architecture. They kind of go hand in hand together a little bit. They're kind of separated within the module listings. One of the things you'll notice about this class is that we started off with very little change in art over the course of thousands of years. Progress in art was very slow. After the mid 1800s, we see one ism after another, one change and evolution in art after another. And so, right now, 20th to 21st century, we're going to see lots of different changes going on. And so, we're going to start with understanding a little bit of this Art Deco movement, the trend towards simplification and purity of line and form that we saw in the Steel and the Bauhaus impacted art and architecture in the 20th century. Many still favor that ornamentation. Such sentiment gave rise to the Art Deco movement. Art Deco is a style of design popular during the 1920s and 30s, but the term was coined in the 1960s, derived from the 1925 Paris Exposition of Decorative Arts, where the style reached its apex. Art Deco is characterized by long, thin forms, curving surfaces, geometric patterning, and described the sleekness of the machine age. The style influenced all aspects of the art, architecture, and decorative graphic and industrial arts, ranging from skyscrapers to ocean liners and toasters, including the chair even that I am in. This is an Art Deco chair. It is a replicated piece. It's not an original, but I'm a big fan of Art Deco furniture. In this unit, our objectives recognize the stylistic characteristics of Art Deco that are interpreted and represented differently throughout the period. Analyze how political art in Europe and in the United States recorded and reacted to political, cultural, and social societal events. Recognize how regionalism was a unique American art movement. All right. So, as we start to look in to this Art Deco period, we're going to see very different changes from what we'd had before. Why is this not loading? Well, let's try this again. Goodness. My apologies. This is not doing what it's supposed to do today, is it? All right. So the first building we're going to again, architecture is kind of one of those themes that's run throughout this course. The Chrysler Building. This is a symbolic architecture of the Art Deco movement in New York City, designed by William Van Allen, 1882 to 1954. One of the first to use stainless steel over a large surface to expose the building surface, it represented the tendency to flaunt the concept of industrialization. And so when you look at it, it has this very mechanical almost look to it. At the time of the construction, the Chrysler Building was involved in a race to be the tallest building in the world. The Bank of Manhattan Building, under construction at the same time, topped out at 927 feet, 2 feet above the Chrysler's announced height. It appeared that the Bank of Manhattan had won, but Van Allen had a plan. The Chrysler Building's spire, a series of sunbursts punctuated by a triangular window, had been secretly assembled in the building's fire shaft. It was then hoisted into place in a 1-ton piece, raising the Chrysler Building's height to 1,046 feet, 119 feet taller than the Bank of Manhattan, and even taller than the Eiffel Tower. And that is this section here at this top. Frank Lloyd Wright was an architect, and we're going to learn more about him as we look at this modern architecture in the next unit. Not all early 20th century artists embraced the machine age. There was rejection to the expansion of the industry, mechanicalization, and technology in favor of the natural and the organic. Frank Lloyd Wright represented this rejection with radical innovation and structure and aesthetics, and to integrate man-made construction seamlessly with nature. He looked really to incorporate the elements around him. Very often his homes were built out of the materials that were native, not just to that area, but literally to the property that the house would sit on. Stones would come from the property very often, the wood, that was often used came from that very general area. At a time when poured reinforced concrete and steel cantilevers were generally confined to commercial structures, Wright did pioneer work in integrating machine methods and material into a true natural architectural expression. He was the first architect in the United States to produce open planning houses, breaking from the tradition of closed space to achieve an organic and fluidity interior space by unifying rooms and eliminating walls that conventionally separated rooms. And so that cantilever they're talking about here is, if you look at this falling water, we see these decks that kind of extend out over that waterfall. That actually the river runs through the house. And one of the reasons is that this house is not very structurally sound. It looks great, but it suffers constantly from water damage. And so, beautiful, unique home. One of the things he did in architecture is he designed everything from the furniture in the homes to the windows. He would do stained glass windows specifically for the homes, even down to very often the silverware that would be used in the home. He designed everything. Frank Lloyd Wright was a totalitarian type of architect. He wanted to design everything within that structure. The Kaufman House, nicknamed Falling Water, is perched on a rocky hillside over a small waterfall. Wright integrated the work into the natural setting by contrasting the shaped concrete, painted metal, natural stone, and strip windows to harmoniously balance the interior and exterior spaces. So again, it does have this sort of geometric that kind of juxtaposed to this organic all around it. And so this geometric form amongst these organic forms is kind of this contrast that he creates. But again, if you look, the construct this area is made of stone from the very stones that are coming up out of the river. So it looks like the house is almost growing up out of that natural environment. Brancusi, as Wright stressed the organic and natural in architecture, Romanian Constantine Brancusi did so with soft curving surfaces in his abstract sculpture in Bird in Space series. The streamlined of the bird in space, stripped of individualizing features, communicates the idea of flight instead of representation of flight. Typical of Brancusi was the brass, smooth, polished point where the materiality of the sculpture is dissolved and reflective in luminosity. Brancusi's work represented his spiritual aspirations and longing for transcendence and material world and its constraints. Alexander Calder, one of my very favorite artists, it was renowned for his non-objective organic forms. Calder was a pioneer in the pioneering figure in the development of kinetic art, creating sculptures in which balanced components move, some driven by motors and others impelled by the actions of air currents. Dadaist Marcel Duchamp first applied this descriptive designation mobiles to those reliant in air alone, either suspended or freestanding. Mobiles consist of flat pieces of painted metal connected by wire veins and stems. The organic shapes are reminiscent of his friend and surrealist painter Jean Moreau. Calder cut, bent, punctured, and twisted his materials entirely by hand. The manual emphasis contributed to the sculpture's evocation and natural form. Shape, size, color, space, and movement were combined to mimic the harmonious but unpredictable activities of nature. So he's reflecting on Moreau here. This is a Moreau work, but this is the Calder mobile that we see. If you ever get a chance to travel to Chicago at the Chicago Museum of Modern and Contemporary Modern Art, it's the Museum of Contemporary Art. Modern Arts in New York, MoMA. We call this the MoCA. The Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago has a ginormous Calder that I love. It's gorgeous, and it kind of slowly moves around, directed by the winds created in that building. Calder wrote, "Disparity in form, size, weight, motion is what makes a composition. It is the apparent accident to regularity which the artist actually controls, but which he makes or mars a work." When we talk about 20th century political art, social realism depicted the social and racial injustice and economic struggles that were a result of turmoil and devastation wrought by the World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and the Depression of World War II. Artists were characterized by the political and/or social message with satire, reflecting on the movement's reaction to the idealist romanticism period. Concentrating on the ugliness of contemporary life, artists recorded what they saw and created public outrage because of the harsh realities that was represented. And so, reflecting all the evils and things that go on in society, pretty much what that's all about. Picasso, when the Spanish Republican government was in exile in Paris during the Spanish Civil War, leaders asked Picasso to paint a work of art for the Spanish Pavilion in Paris, in the Paris International Exhibition. The artist depicted the horrific destruction of the Basque capital of Guernica, which was nearly obliterated by Nazi bombers in support of the Spanish rebel general Francisco Franco in 1937. So I understand that Franco literally paid the Germans to bomb the cities to support a revolution that he was in part of. The attack was particularly brutal because it was during the busiest hour of the busiest day of the week, market day. Over 7,000 men, women, and children were killed or wounded during this brief but vicious attack. In Pablo Picasso's depiction, there are no German planes or bombs, only the sheer horror of the massacre. The cubist-like fragmentation, distortion, and colorless palette intensify the stark brutality of the atrocity. At the bottom is a fallen warrior, the broken sword representing the defenselessness of slaughtered Basque. Over him, a gored horse convulses and throes of gruesome death. In the center left a mother screams in agony over her murdered child, while behind her stands an emotionless bull, which, according to Picasso, symbolizes the brutality and darkness. On the right of the composition are a woman dying in a burning building, the far right, a severe wounded woman attempting to escape the chaos, and bottom right, a woman with a lamp, upper right that represents the illumination of the tragedy. And that's these areas we see here. Lang and Lawrence. Oh, okay. Dorothea Lang was a photographer hired by Resettlement Administration, a New Deal government agency, to chronicle the rural people who were displaced by the Great Depression. In her photograph, Migrant Mother, the fate of the starving, penniless, and homeless migrant workers of the Nipomo Valley after the Corps have been devastated by a freeze and is represented. Lang has captured the despair, the strength, the weather-worn face of a migrant mother who is trustingly surrounded by her helpless children. This class is fairly Eurocentric. The fact that we have Jacob Lawrence as the single representative of the entire Harlem Renaissance is just disgusting. The Harlem Renaissance was this enormous movement in Harlem. It did not just apply to the visual arts, but there were dozens, if not hundreds, of visual artists working in the Harlem Renaissance time and during this period. Musicians, poets, writers of all kinds. It really was an entire whole arts movement and revolution. And so when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, this is the slice they get you of an enormous pie. The African American artist Jacob Lawrence was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance and the political art of Goya and Damir. Lawrence depicted the post-World War I fight of African Americans from the South, of African Americans from the South to North, and the migration of the Negro series. And this migration is what sparked this Harlem Renaissance. Harlem was predominantly a white area. As African Americans moved up from the South, they moved into Harlem area, and in doing so, they created an entire community that really functioned artistically in a unique and revolutionary way. The hope of finding improved economic, political, and social opportunities was unsuccessful, as many journeymen found the conditions in the North were often much better than in the South, not much better than in the South. This piece is characteristic of the artist's style, with a rhythmic arrangement of bold, flat shapes and strong color. A lot of the artists that worked during the Harlem Renaissance were semi-untrained artists, so we see a lot of the simplicity harkening back to those flat colors, flat shapes, simple colors, and so forth. The the period was dominated not just by men, but there were a lot of women who worked in the area. In the arts, there were um, poets, that musicians, dancers, in every area of the arts. There was an explosion during the Harlem Renaissance that you're not going to hear about in this class, and I apologize for that. Hopper, a more subtle form of political commentary, is found in the works of Edward Hopper. The artist's works are characterized by a generalized feeling of loneliness, isolation, and alienation as depicted in Nighthawks. Although trained as an illustrator, Edward Hopper spent 5 years studying painting under Robert Hendry, a member of the Ashton School of Painters, who focused on the gritty realities of the city. The Ashcan School influenced Hopper's style, but he separated himself through his tendency to depict urban isolation instead of urban living. Nighthawks was inspired by a restaurant in New York's Greenwich Avenue, where two streets meet. The painting reveals three customers lost in their own private thoughts. The anonymous and uncommunicative night owls seem as remote from the viewer as they are from one another. Hopper often denied that he purposefully infused any of his paintings with symbols of isolation and emptiness. He acknowledged of Nighthawks that, unconsciously probably, I was painting the loneliness of a large city. We talk about regionalism. An American phenomenon refers to a group of artists, rural artists, mostly from the Midwest, who came to prominence in the 1930s. Not being part of the coordinated movement, regionalists often had an idiosyncratic point of view that reflected the United States as a heavily agricultural nation, separate itself from the industrialized cities such as New York and Chicago. They shared a humble, anti-modern in style and fineness for depicting everyday life. The regionalist rural conservatism put them at odds with the urban and leftist social realists of the same era. Both periods succumbed to abstract expressionism eventually. And regionalism was a much bigger movement than a single page here. Recognize that the large industrial areas of this country represent a very tiny portion of this actual country. The country is dominated by rural areas, and that was more reflective of that regionalism. Grant Wood's American Gothic caused a stir in 1930 when it was exhibited for the first time in the Art Institute of Chicago and awarded the prize of $300. Newspapers across the country carried the story, and the painting of a farm couple posed before a White House brought the artist instant fame. The Iowa native, then in his late 30s, was enchanted by a cottage he'd seen in the small southern Iowa town of Eldon. Its Gothic revival style indicated the upper lancet window, designed to resemble a medieval pointed arch, inspired the painting's title. He asked his dentist and sister, Nan, to pose as a farmer and his unmarried daughter. The highly detailed style of the rigid frontal arrangement of the figures was inspired by the Northern Renaissance art, and the artist studied during the 3 trips to Europe. After returning to Iowa, he became increasingly appreciative of the traditions of the Midwest, which he also celebrated in works such as this. The work is a primary example of regionalism due to the true depiction of the rural American subjects, rendered in the representational style. The painting can be read as a glorification of moral virtue, rural America, or even an ambitious mixture of praise and satire. Benton, Thomas Hart Benton's The Lord is My Shepherd represents regionalism as a man and woman are depicted finishing a frugal meal together. There are only 2 plates on the table and an empty coffee cup, a sugar bowl full of spoons. The couple may be poor, but they have great dignity. Powerful, gnarled hands represent the lifetime of hard work. Painter knew these sitters. They were in real life. They were deaf mutes who lived near him in Martha's Vineyard. Benton's transformed them into symbols of old-fashioned rural values they championed in regionalist fashion. The quote hanging on the wall behind the man's head is part of a quote from the Bible, "Lord is my shepherd," from which the title of the work is taken. The man and his wife stand for faith, hard work, temperance, and the endurance of the qualities Benton believed were the cornerstones of the American way of life. Again, I'm disgusted that we had this much about regionalism and nothing about Harlem Renaissance. Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros. After the Mexican Revolution, a group of artists sought to both highlight and validate Mexico's history and a place to communicate in the world community through sweeping murals. Orozco painted many murals both in Mexico and abroad. In The Rich Banquet, White of Workers' Quarrel, Orozco depicts a social commentary on a lack of equality or equity within society. The artist's bitter and satirical comment on the financial inequity is also highlights the divisiveness between the working class and upper class. We have that still today. Diego Rivera was that guy so nice that Frida Kahlo married him twice. Diego Rivera was a child prodigy who originated from Cuban style when he lived in Paris and influenced by Picasso. Rivera believed Mexico was in need of national and artistic revolution. His murals are complex, decorative, and animated scenes that depict the social and political current events at that time. This portion of the sweeping series of murals in the National Palace in Mexico City highlights the devastation and suffering brought by the Europeans in the 16th century. Rivera's style reflects a Renaissance influence in the frescoes, yet monumental changes in bold color. Monumental shape, in bold color. I wish they could make these smaller. If they were smaller, you couldn't see any of the detail. Obviously, we need much bigger images to be comparing. And so what we're going to look at now is how we go into modern architecture. And I'm going to try to race through this because I know we're kind of running out of time here. But we're going to recognize integration that naturalistic form and organic elements within modernist architecture. Again, Frank Lloyd Wright. Examine the visual language that define postmodern architecture and modern architecture. And so we start off talking about if the module will work correctly. It's not going to work. What is going on? Here we go. Frank Lloyd Wright is known for his organic style and shape. The marriage of architecture with natural environment. The design of the Solomon Art Guggenheim Museum in New York City was inspired by the spiral of a snail shell and has sculptural quality with the curves and circles that define the building. If you've never been exposed, this is a unique type of building. Probably different than anything you've ever been in, interior and exterior. Great big sweeping curves. Le Corbusier, another sculpted architecture is Notre Dame des Hautes in Ronchamp, France. The work is designed by Charles Edouard Genet, better known as Le Corbusier. The artist's work, inspired by praying hands, the wings of a dove, and the bow of a ship. The Latin word for ship is nave, replaced an earlier structure on the medieval pilgrimage site that was destroyed in World War II. The organic sculptural quality of Le Corbusier's church also creates a mystical atmosphere. This is an interior space. Note how the curvilinear shapes along the thick, plain walls, deeply recessed stained glass windows give the sculpture, the structure, the qualities of a hermit's cave or isolated medieval monastery. Jean Utzon's sculpted modernist. The Sydney Opera House is an Australian national symbol. The organic forms are depicted on a truly monumental scale. These huge, and they're covered now in all of these little LEDs. So they have gorgeous light shows. The structure now we see this kind of white completely changes constantly. The clusters of concrete shells resting on massive platforms recall ogival Gothic arches. Seabirds and sails of ships, which are certainly appropriate for the cultural center by the sea. And again, if you see that at night, it's lit up. It's crazy. It's beautiful. Van der Rohe, as it was alluded to earlier, all modern architectures followed the organic sculptural trend. Many preferred simple geometric rigid design, following the less is more philosophy depicted here by Miles van der Rohe. You can see this building is a classical building that it's a Seagram building set back against a broad plaza. Its cubic structure is expressed by extruded bronze I-beams imposed on the brooding dark glass and curtain wall. The tower sits squarely in a series of two-story bronze columns and is surrounded by 20-foot high arcade. The combination of bronze I-beams and dark glass curtain make the Seagram building seem like different structures viewed from different angles. It kind of reflects what's going on around it, so it changes no matter where you're standing. A black glass tower from one angle, a polished bronze from another. The color can change from brown, so dark to appear almost black, to a soft golden brown, depending on the angle of the viewer and the lighting. Postmodernist architecture, this is a term to describe the art, visual, literary, etc., that followed after and deviated from the 20th century movements that constituted modernism. Postmodernist view is cool and ironic. It tends to concentrate on surfaces rather than depths to eliminate separation of high and low culture. The postmodern architecture movement has been a reaction to and a rejection of the interpersonal and formal elements of modernism. Postmodern architecture is characterized by complexity, decorative elements with a personal touch, symbolism, returns in and an interest in surface colors and texture are popular. If you think about that blue building at the corner of Man of War and Richmond Road in Lexington, that's kind of reflective of this modernist architecture, something you might, or postmodernist architecture you might be familiar with locally. Charles Moore, Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans is an open area which nestled between downtown high-rises. It was constructed to honor the city's Italian-American community. Moore represented Italy's rich artistic heritage with his work. From ancient times, there's an influence of the Roman Fora, the marketplace, and the presence of all the classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. The circular shape of the piazza recalls the Renaissance, the irregular colonnades of our mannerism. Moore represented the contemporary period in his use of stainless steel columns and striking juxtapositions of color. So you see pretty much a broad range of not just materials, but stylistic influences as well. Graves, Rogers, and Piano. Graves, the postmodern architecture of Portland Public Service Building in Portland, Oregon, is characterized as the complexity and color. The unique, purely decorative features, which contrast sharply with the modernist structures, are indicative of the departure from that modernist sculpture, or modernist architecture. And so this is a really nice building. I love the simplicity of this big, massive cube. Rogers and Piano, the Georges Pompidou National Center of Art and Culture in Paris, a six-level building that contains modern and art museum, a theater, a library, theaters, music, industrial design centers, and a restaurant. The work was personal vision of the architects Richard Rogers of England and Italian Renzo Piano, who sought to expose the structure's inner workings. And you can kind of see it almost looks like it's in construction as they're building it, because he's kind of demonstrating that interior workings as if it's still not finished. The idea is reinforced by color: red for the people, the red on the elevator shaft, the tubular passageways, green for the water pipes, blue for the air conditioning ducts, and yellow for the electricity tubes. Deconstructivist architecture. Many of the works of postmodern architecture are also considered deconstructionist. Deconstructionist is also sort of a response to Picasso and Cubism, Duchamp and Cubism, where the artists up until that point were constructing stuff. They were then in Cubism begin to deconstruct. That's what they were doing in architectures. Architects were also doing in architecture. Deconstructivism attempts to view architecture in bits and pieces. In these works, the basic elements of architecture are dismantled. Deconstructivist buildings appear to lack visual logic. They often appear to be made of unrelated, disharmonious, abstract forms. Again, harken back to that Cubist period. Sterling, the Noel Stagiaire, boy, I butchered that, in Stuttgart, Germany, designed by James Sterling, represents deconstructive architecture. The classical segmented arches and rustication are mixed with bright greens, pinks, and blues. The combination of straight and curvilinear elements that meet at straight and strange angles. And it's kind of makes an uncomfortable feeling when everything kind of meets at those weird, strange angles. Last but not least, Gehry. Deconstructivist architecture Frank Gehry plans his architectural works by creating a modern, cutting it up, then continually and progressively rearranging the pieces until he achieves an artistic vision. Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, is dramatic asymmetry of imbalanced forms that characterize deconstructivism, deconstructivist architecture. The combination of traditional and contemporary building materials, limestone and titanium, indicate the departure from modern architecture. So, think about the Guggenheim in New York. That was her husband's. This is the wife's, Gehry's Guggenheim. This almost has the look of a battleship, versus that big snail-looking thing that we saw in the Guggenheim. And so that's what we're looking at this week, all the way, everything. Art Deco to modernist architecture, and everything in between. All right. Function determined by form. Modernist and postmodernist architecture was defined by the purpose of the building, the intent of the architect, and the environmental context. So now you know everything there is to know about that postmodernist architecture period. All right. Thanks a lot for playing. Have a great day, guys.